Hi, I'm Alfred Ells from Leaders at Last Ministries. I'm the founder director of this organization. Our mission is to help churches and organizations succeed in ministry, as well as pastors sustain pastoral excellence. And today I want to talk about governance because how governance works in a church makes all the difference for success in the future. And there's a lot of confusion about governance. There's a lot of lack of knowledge about governance. So today I want to give you an introduction and kind of a scope and a view of what governance is, what it isn't, and things you can do to govern your church better. I remember the very first time that I ever sat on a board of directors. It was a community board for drug abuse. And I didn't have any background or experience on how do you behave, not behave, what is the role I should assume on the board. I just sat on the board and kind of imitated what I saw other people do. So when other people asked questions, I asked questions. When other people made comments, I made comments. And later on, I found out that none of them really knew what they were doing either. So I don't think we were a very effective board. And the truth of the matter is very few people study to learn boardmanship. They normally bring whatever experience they have to a board of directors because they want to serve the church, they want to help out, but they aren't really trained in good governance. Now, when I talk about governance, I'm talking about a thing called a board of directors or a board of elders or a board of trustees. The nomenclature is not that significant. Different churches, because of tradition, call it different things, whether elders, trustees, or directors. What it means, though, it's a body of people, a group of people who are formed together to provide the ultimate responsibility, accountability, and authority for the organization, for the church. This group of people are called a board of directors or board of trustees, whatever. What you'll find is in some states in the United States, that's a requirement that there be at least 3 people for a board, and there's no maximum. So a lot of board of directors have 3 to 5 people or more, even up to 15 at times. And these people are supposed to get together a minimum of at least once a year. That's the law for most organizations in most states. And in so doing, they should oversee the work of the organization and the ministry. And now, when I talk about the work of the organization ministry, I'm talking about what the whole staff, the organization does. One of the things we found is a lot of people think that the minister, for example, or the lead pastor is totally in charge of the church. That's not quite accurate. What happens is the law delegates to the church board its responsibility to be totally responsible for the church. The church board then delegates that responsibility to the person they choose or the congregation chooses to lead the church. So it's a delegated responsibility given to the senior minister, and the senior minister then is to work with the board in implementing his or her authority to make sure the church works. So that's what governance is about. It's about boards of directors, boards of elders, or boards of trustees, and how they and the senior leader work together to manage, direct, and grow the church for God's purposes. I want to talk about why governance. Why should we have a board of directors? Why should we have a governance system in place for a church or a ministry? Well, the federal government and the state governments require governance because organizations such as churches or charities do what's called serve in the public good. That means they're created to serve the well-being of the community, the neediness of people, for example, food for the poor, clothing for the people who are needy, et cetera, or homeless. So they serve the public good. Now, as a result of serving the public good, they're given a special status, a privileged status. And that privileged status is that every dollar you give to a charity is $1 less the federal government gets. So if I donate $100 to my church, that's $100 that the federal government doesn't get because I get a tax write-off for it. So the government says, well, listen, if we're going to give you this special status, this privileged status of being able to help people and let people give you money instead of giving it to the government, then we want some accountability. We want a system that has accountability, and that system is the governance system. It's choosing a board of directors of anywhere from 3 to 5 or even up to 15 people who are constituents of the ministry. In other words, these are people that represent the public good that you're serving. They serve on your board of directors in order to make sure that the board of directors does what it says it's going to do to make sure the organization does what it says it's going to do. Or another way of saying it, it fulfills the mission of the ministry. That's why the federal government requires it. A board is there to fulfill the mission of the ministry, to assure that what is written on the wall happens down the hall, and therefore there's accountability for the freedom that it gives us and the special status. I want to talk about the problem of governance. Another way of saying it is, what is the problem with governance that most people encounter? And you'll find that normally governing people who serve on boards of directors, have difficulty with their role. They don't often know exactly what to do or not do. I fondly recall how when I first was on a board of directors, I did not know what to do. I had to imitate what other people did to try to learn my role. So you'll find most people who sit on a board of directors are people of goodwill. In other words, they want to help their ministry. They want to somehow be a blessing. And they're usually more experienced people. They've been Christians for a number of years. They've been in the church for a number of years. And so they're some of the more prominent people. But that doesn't mean they have the skill set to really govern. So they sit on a board of directors, a board of elders, and they govern, and they bring with them whatever their expectation is of how it should be or shouldn't be, not a sophisticated knowledge of how you govern. The same goes with the senior leader of a ministry, the pastor, or whomever. They also aren't usually experts in governance. They've never had a course in governance in a seminary. Seminaries don't teach governance. And maybe they've read a book or two and therefore have some working knowledge, but they're also not usually experts in governance. So we have senior leaders working with boards of directors, boards of elders, trying to see and oversee the entire church system, and they're not experts in the territory. That's why there's a problem. The problem is that we are not trained for governance, and therefore we need to learn what governance is, what it isn't, and how to conduct ourselves. I want to give you 5 tips, 5 key issues and 5 key things that if a church will do, a senior leader will do, you'll become more equipped to govern well and govern effectively. These 5 things are kind of the foundation of governance, and I'll go over those next. I want to talk about the first tip for how to become a real qualified, competent board member, or another way of saying it, how to have a competent, qualified governance system. And the tip number 1 is best said like this: learn the 10 fundamental responsibilities of a board member and of a board. 10 fundamental responsibilities. Now, right now I won't go into detail with all 10. On my website you'll find them detailed under resources, but here's an example of one of them. For example, one clear responsibility, fundamental responsibility, is that the board of directors should be the custodian of the mission of the church. The board of directors should know what the mission is. In other words, what is this church really called to do? Is it called to feed the poor? Is it called to evangelize people? What's it called to do? It's the board of directors that keeps mission creep from occurring. We heard in the Middle Eastern wars that whole term called mission creep, where we went in there with one agenda, and in the middle of that agenda we kind of drifted into other agendas. A board of directors is supposed to make sure the ministry and the organization does not drift, that what it says it's going to do, it does, and it sticks to it. That would be an example of one fundamental responsibility of the board. There's 9 others. The last one being, it's essential that a board of directors, a board of elders, pray for the ministry and its mission and its personnel. It's a prayer burden and responsibility you take if you take a fiduciary or caretaking responsibility for the ministry. The moment you sit on a board of directors and say, I will help oversee this board, oversee this ministry, and make sure it does what God called it to do, then I should pray for that. It should be a prayer burden of my life for the people in that ministry as well as the mission. So those are examples of 2 of the 10 fundamental responsibilities. There's 8 more, and they should be learned and embraced by everybody. Tip number 2 is really important. Tip number 2 is everybody should know their role as a board member. Or another way of saying it, you should know your job description. Just like in a company you work for, or if you even work for the church, you would have a job description that will give you the extent of your authority and list what your responsibilities are. It ought to be the same for board members. Board members ought to know what their responsibilities are, and it ought to be done in writing in a job description format. As a special note, the board chairperson has a little bit different role and responsibility than board members. The board chairperson is responsible to manage the board members themselves. He or she should make sure that committees do their work in a timely manner and effective manner. He or she should make sure the board members do their work in a positive, encouraging, and helpful manner. So the board chairperson is like over the board members. They are subject to his or her authority. And if the board chairperson is doing a good job, the board members are fulfilling their role, the board usually works very well. Tip number 3 is about ethical practices. All board members should know what the ethical practices of the organization are and follow them. Now, what I mean by an ethical practice, ethics are a group of standards or rules that you go by. There are rules for board members on how they should or shouldn't behave. For example, board members have no authority as an individual. They only have what's called collective authority. When a board tells the leader of the ministry to do something, the whole board has to vote on it and tell the ministry leader to do something. No individual board member can go to the ministry leader and say, here's what I want you to do. The exception is if the whole board of directors has delegated that responsibility and authority to an individual or a committee. Otherwise, you speak all as one voice or not at all. So there's ethical practices that govern board members. And they're very important because when board members don't know how to behave relationally with the senior minister and other staff members, then all kinds of problems occur. So ethical practices are very important. Every board member should know them, abide by them, and be really supportive of their ethical practices. Tip number 4 is all about models of government. I think it's very important for every board member to know that there are different models of governing. There's models of governance that apply to smaller churches, while others apply to larger churches. And what you have to do is find which is the most appropriate and healthiest one for the stage of development of your church. For example, if you have a very small church, maybe 40 members or something like that, the model of governance is going to be pretty simple. It's not going to be elaborate. And the model of government you have is going to be mainly what we call pastoral support. The board members are there to make sure the pastor is supported, taken care of, because the pastor is doing all the work of the ministry. So in a sense, he is the church. But as churches grow and even become, for example, mega churches, that shift becomes more and more important that the board not just be concerned with the pastor, but be concerned even more and more with the mission and the personnel and all the things that go with governing a church. And a large church, for example, needs a lot of attention in ways that we call policy governance. There are main policy issues that need to be decided upon. There's policy issues that are very important for the action of the church that will preserve it over time. So policy governance becomes more and more the model. And you'll see churches then and governance systems be more concerned about how we set policy than just individual decisions about staff or the senior leader. Tip number 5 is get help when a crisis occurs. I've been called into so many board crises over the years that I'm convinced more than ever that whenever a crisis occurs, find someone who really knows about board governance, knows how to resolve these crises, and has been through it before. You don't know what you don't know, is the old saying, and it's so true. There's so many aspects to crises with boards of directors, especially if they reflect or involve the senior minister, that an outside party who understands those things can be such great help. It's amazing. Now, boards of directors that don't get outside help tend to have more conflict, tend to kind of draw out the conflict longer, and create more and more disruption and more distrust in the whole staff as well as the congregation. So get help. There are people out there who really know how to help solve crises. Those are the people you ought to get. In closing, I want to say once again, this is a really big topic. And what I've given you is a short, small overview of some of the essentials. But check out our website. We have on our website certain papers and descriptions and even articles that will give you more information about governance and how to practice it and how to be really competent in your governance. We also have other resources available, and we'll have other videos like this on the website about topics relevant for leaders. So go to www.leadersoflast.org and good governance.